In the early 1960s, inside Pontiac, a chief engineer named John DeLorean and a small circle of men set out to break a rule their own corporation had written. General Motors had drawn a hard line meant to keep its divisions in their place and the horsepower wars in check, a policy that held the biggest engines out of its smaller cars. DeLorean's engineers read that rule the way a careful lawyer reads a contract, and they found the single seam its authors had left unguarded. Through that opening, they built a machine the corporation had expressly forbidden, gave it a name borrowed from the fastest cars in Europe, and put it on sale before anyone above them could object. It is widely remembered as the first true American muscle car, and every rival in Detroit would scramble to copy what a handful of Pontiac men had smuggled past their own company. That single act of defiance did more than sell cars. It told the country what Pontiac was. Not the sensible companion brand it had been built to be, but the division of speed, of excitement, of rules bent until they broke. For a generation, that identity carried Pontiac to the front rank of the American automobile. But the brand that was born by breaking General Motors' rules would die half a century later with no rules left to break. Its performance would be engineered out of it. Its cars would become other companies' cars, wearing a Pontiac grille, a rebadged Chevrolet, and in the end, a rebadged Toyota. And in 2009, the whole enterprise would be shut down inside the largest industrial bankruptcy the country had ever seen. The story that usually gets told is a simple one: a healthy brand cut down by the government's bailout, sacrificed so that General Motors could survive. The record tells a harder story. Long before any federal restructuring touched it, GM had already dissolved the one thing that made a Pontiac a Pontiac. The bankruptcy did not kill the division. It only signed the certificate for a death the parent had already caused. The story of how General Motors came to execute its own muscle car empire is also the story of how that empire was built, and it begins in 1926 with a brand created to save another division and destined to devour it instead. Chapter 1: The brand that ate its own parent. In 1926, General Motors created a new automobile with an old name attached to nothing it had built. The corporation took the name from Pontiac, the Ottawa war chief, and from the city of Pontiac, Michigan, where the car would be assembled. The new make was not meant to stand on its own. It was designed as a companion make, a lower-priced stablemate to General Motors' Oakland division, built to sit beneath Oakland on the price ladder, and hold buyers inside the corporation until they were ready to move up to Oakland's costlier cars. A companion make exists to serve the division above it. That was the whole of Pontiac's assignment. Undercut the price, catch the buyers Oakland could not reach, and let the parent brand collect them once they could afford to move up. Pontiac did the opposite. From its earliest years, it sold in numbers Oakland could not approach, offering nearly everything a buyer wanted in Oakland's showroom at a price Oakland's own cars did not match. The corporation had built a feeder and gotten a rival. The reversal did not stay theoretical for long. By the end of the 1920s, Oakland was already the smaller name under its own roof. In 1932, General Motors stopped building Oakland automobiles altogether. By 1933, Pontiac had absorbed what was left of it: the factory floor, the dealer network, the place in General Motors' own family of brands. The corporation folded Oakland into history and kept Pontiac standing in its place. No other companion make General Motors ever created managed the same reversal. Pontiac alone was born to serve a parent and ended by replacing it. It was the only General Motors companion brand in the corporation's history to outlive the division it had been built to support. Inside General Motors' own order of things, the inversion was complete. A division created as a feeder, a doorway, a cheaper stepping stone toward something else, had outgrown the brand above it and taken its factory and its customers in the process. The corporation did not describe it that way at the time. It described strong Pontiac sales and a rationalized lineup, the kind of language a company reaches for when a demotion needs to sound like a decision. The mechanism underneath the language was plain enough. Pontiac had been built to be outgrown. Instead, it grew past the brand it was supposed to feed and consumed it. By the middle of the 1930s, Pontiac was no longer anyone's junior partner. It was a fully established General Motors division in its own right, with its own factories and its own place in the corporation's family of makes, no longer a doorway to anywhere else. What it did not yet have was a reason to exist beyond that. A car built to undercut Oakland, and then the automobile that had swallowed Oakland whole was still, through the years that followed, defined mostly by what it was not. It was not the economy brand. It was not the luxury brand. For 3 more decades, decades, it would be a solid, largely unremarkable seller, competent and easily mistaken for its rivals, waiting for something to make it matter on its own terms instead of as a placeholder in someone else's plan. That something would not come from a boardroom decision or a marketing campaign. It would come from a handful of engineers inside the division who were willing to do to General Motors' own rulebook exactly what Pontiac itself had once done to Oakland. Read a set of rules meant to keep it in its place and find the opening that let it become something its creator had never intended. Chapter 2, The Rule Breakers. The rule was a number, and the number was 330. By the early 1960s, General Motors had become the largest industrial corporation on Earth, and it governed its divisions the way a cautious institution governs its own ambition, through written policy meant to keep any one part from reaching too far. One such policy addressed the relationship between the size of a car and the size of its engine. A mid-sized car, in the corporation's judgment, had no business carrying a large engine. Part of the concern was image, and part of it was hierarchy, the quiet arithmetic that kept the biggest engines in the biggest and most expensive cars, where the profit lived. The rule itself was plain. No General Motors Intermediate would be built with an engine larger than 330 cubic inches. Inside Pontiac, a small group of engineers looked at that rule and saw the gap in it. The division's chief engineer, DeLorean, and the men working alongside him understood something the policy's authors had not thought to guard against. The rule governed the engine a car came with his standard. It said nothing about what a buyer could add. If the corporation forbade a large engine as standard equipment, the remedy was simply to make the large engine an option, a line on the order form a customer could choose, and let the factory assemble the car the corporation had declared could not exist. So they took the division's mid-size car, the Tempest, and offered it with a 389 cubic inch V8, an engine far past the ceiling GM had set. To give the thing a name worthy of what it was, they reached for the most exotic reference in the sport, the Ferrari 250 GTO, and simply borrowed its initials. The 1964 Pontiac GTO went on sale as an options package, and in doing so, it quietly broke a rule its own parent had written. It is widely credited as the first true muscle car, a full-size engine dropped into an affordable mid-size body, and it did what the men who built it had gambled it would do. It sold. Then it sold in numbers that could not be ignored, and every rival in Detroit scrambled to build a copy of the car Pontiac had smuggled past its own corporation. The engine at the heart of it was no ordinary upgrade. Pontiac fitted the 389 with tri-power induction, 3 two-barrel carburetors feeding a V8 rated at 348 horsepower, figures that belonged in a far costlier machine, and the man who had willed it into being was climbing as fast as the cars he built. DeLorean had joined Pontiac in 1956 and taken the division chief engineer's chair in 1961, and in 1965, at the age of 41, he became the youngest division general manager in the history of General Motors. He followed the GTO with the Firebird in 1967 and the Grand Prix in 1969. Then, in 1973, he left the corporation entirely to build a car company under his own name, a venture that would end in a mark as short-lived as the GTO proved enduring. The engineer who made his reputation breaking Pontiac's rules did not stay to see what the corporation would do to Pontiac once the rule breakers were gone. In that single act of engineering defiance, Pontiac found the thing it had lacked for its first 3 decades. It found a character. The division built to be humble, the sensible car for careful people, was suddenly the division of speed, of nerve, of the machine that had gotten away with something. And the market rewarded the transformation. Every year from 1962 through 1970, Pontiac ranked 3rd in national automobile sales, behind only Chevrolet and Ford, moving well over 500,000 cars in a good year and coming within reach of 1 million in 1968. For the better part of a decade, the brand that had once been notable for nothing was the 3rd most popular nameplate in the United States. The identity hardened into an icon. Pontiac gave the country the Firebird and then the Trans Am, cars whose entire promise was that they were not sensible, that they existed for the pleasure of driving fast in something that looked the part. In 1977, a black and gold Trans Am carried Burt Reynolds through the film Smokey and the Bandit, and the effect on the showroom floor was immediate. immediate. Buyers wanted the car they had watched outrun the law, and the sales of black and gold Trans Ams that followed the picture were, in the trade's own word, unbelievable. A Pontiac had become an object of desire, something a young man taped to his bedroom wall, and no corporate policy had planned for that. It had been willed into being by a handful of engineers who decided the company was leaving something extraordinary unbuilt. By the early 1980s, the division put the whole of that identity into 3 words and sold it back to the country as a promise. We build excitement. The slogan was not a boast so much as a description. Excitement was by then the only thing Pontiac had that its corporate siblings did not. The single quality that explained why a buyer would choose it over the cheaper Chevrolet sitting a few feet away in the same dealership. Every division at General Motors could build a competent car. Only Pontiac had spent 20 years teaching the public that it built a thrilling one. This is the measure worth fixing in place before the story turns downward, because everything that came after is the story of its subtraction. Pontiac's difference was not a marketing conceit. It was a real thing, engineered, proven at the register, embedded in the culture. The brand had a reason to exist, and the reason was that it was not the same as the cars around it. That difference was the one asset General Motors would spend the next 20 years taking back. Chapter 3, the same car in a different suit. The method had a name inside the industry. They called it badge engineering. It was not a scandal and it was not a secret. It was accounting applied to sheet metal. A modern automobile is built on a platform, the shared floor pan and structure and running gear that account for most of what a car costs to design and to certify and to build. Bodies and grills and interiors are comparatively cheap to vary. So a corporation that owned several brands could design one platform, spread that enormous cost across all of them, and sell what was fundamentally a single car under 4 different names, each with its own badge on the hood. To a man reading the ledger in the General Motors Tower in Detroit, this was not vandalism, it was prudence. It was the elimination of waste. The trouble was that Pontiac's entire worth had been built on the opposite proposition. A Chevrolet could afford to be the same as the car beside it because a Chevrolet had never promised to be anything but sensible and affordable. Pontiac had spent 20 years teaching the country that it was the exception on the showroom floor, the division whose cars were quicker and bolder and more alive than their corporate cousins. That was the whole of the argument for paying a little more and choosing the Pontiac over the Chevrolet parked a few feet away. Difference was not one of Pontiac's assets. It was the only one. And difference was precisely the thing badge engineering was designed to destroy. The poison worked slowly, and it worked from the inside. Over its final decades, one platform at a time, the excitement division was quietly folded into the corporation it had once embarrassed. A Pontiac and a Chevrolet would be handed the same floor pan, the same suspension, the same engine, and then sent to 2 different design studios to be given 2 different grills and 2 different names and sold as 2 different cars to the same customer. On the order form, the buyer could still choose the Pontiac. Under the sheet metal, there was less and less left to choose. Decision by cost-saving decision, the division that had once bent the corporation's own rulebook to build the first muscle car was being reduced to a styling exercise, a set of headlamps, and a nameplate bolted onto machinery it no longer had any hand in designing. There was a single pairing that students of the brand's death would later name as the moment the argument was lost. When a Pontiac Grand Am and a Chevrolet Cavalier came to ride the same bones, the 2 cars differed in almost nothing a buyer could feel from the driver's seat. The Grand Am had been one of the division's volume cars, a name that still carried a trace of the old Pontiac promise. Now it was a Cavalier in a costlier suit, and the customer who chose it was paying for a badge, a grill, and the fading memory of what the badge had once meant. The performance division had become, in every way that reached the road, a Chevrolet with better advertising. The men who signed those decisions were not trying to kill anything. Each consolidation, taken alone, was defensible, even wise. A shared platform saved real money. A common engine simplified the factories. No single memo ever proposed to erase what Pontiac was, because no single memo needed to. The erasure was the sum of 100 reasonable economies, each one shaving away a little more of the difference, until the brand that had been an object of desire was a trim level with delusions of a past. The corporation could measure the money it saved. It had no line on any ledger for the thing it was spending. The slogan was still running. We build excitement. Pontiac kept saying it into the 1980s and beyond, kept printing it under the badge at the very moment the corporation behind it was engineering the excitement out. The words had described something true once, a real difference engineered into the cars and proven at the register. Now they described a memory. A promise that had been earned by a handful of engineers was being quietly repudiated by the accountants 2 floors up, and the only people who did not seem to notice were the ones still paying the copywriters to repeat it. By the turn of the century, the logic had run nearly to its end. A Pontiac was increasingly whatever other car in the corporation happened to share its bones, wearing a Pontiac face for the length of a sales cycle. The division that had defined itself against sameness had been made part by part and platform by platform into one of the most interchangeable badges in the company. What remained was to make it visible, to produce the cars in which the whole quiet strategy would finally stand out in the open where anyone could see it. If you find yourself drawn to the way America's great names are built and then hollowed out from within, consider subscribing. Motor Eulogies takes up one of them every few days and follows it all the way to the ground. Because the strategy did become visible in the end. For most of 2 decades, badge engineering had been an internal accounting, a thing you could only see in the parts catalogs and the platform charts, invisible to the buyer who simply drove the car home. But GM was about to build 2 Pontiacs in which the sameness could no longer be hidden. One would be a machine so misshapen that the country would name it among the worst cars ever made. The other would not even be a General Motors car at all. Together, they would say aloud what the ledgers had been saying in private for 20 years, that a Pontiac was no longer required to be anything in particular. The division born to be different had been made the same as the cars it once humiliated. All that was left was to put a face on it. Chapter 4. The Ugliest Symptom. For 20 years, the strategy had lived in the parts catalogs, a thing the buyer never saw. In 2001, it walked onto the showroom floor and stood in the light, and the country recoiled from it. The car was the Pontiac Aztec, and it had begun as something close to a good idea. In the late 1990s, Pontiac had sketched a small, rugged utility vehicle for younger buyers, an early attempt at the crossover, the very shape that would come to dominate American roads a decade later. The division that had once been first to the muscle car was, for a moment, first again to a trend. Then the idea was handed to the corporation, and the corporation did to it what the corporation now did to everything. To hold down cost, the Aztec was forced onto an existing minivan platform it was never drawn for, and the proportions that had looked lean and purposeful on the concept stand were stretched and swollen to fit machinery underneath them that belonged to another kind of vehicle entirely. What reached the dealers was misshapen, top-heavy, and strange, a design pulled in 2 directions by a committee and an accountant and satisfying neither. It had been engineered, in a sense, by consensus. The Aztec was shaped against reams of focus group research, its features chosen by asking crowds of strangers what they thought they wanted, and the result was a car that answered to everyone and belonged to no one. The reviews were not merely unkind, they were historic. Time would later fix the Aztec on its list of the 50 worst cars of all time, and the hosts of National Public Radio's Car Talk named it the ugliest car of its year, for a division whose entire inheritance was desire, whose cars had once been taped to bedroom walls. The most famous Pontiac of the new century was an object of ridicule. The excitement division had built a punchline, and the punchline sold in the numbers a punchline sells. The Aztec was the loud humiliation. The quieter one cut deeper because it was not really a Pontiac at all. In 2003, the division began selling a compact called the Vibe. It was a decent, sensible, entirely competent small car, and every important thing about it had been engineered in Japan. The Vibe was a Toyota Matrix wearing a Pontiac face, co-developed with Toyota and assembled beside its twin at NUMMI, the joint General Motors and Toyota plant in Fremont, California. The logic on the ledger was sound. Toyota knew how to build a reliable economy car more cheaply than Detroit did, and here was a way to put one in a Pontiac showroom without paying to invent it, but follow what it meant. The division that had smuggled a 389 past its own corporation to build the first muscle car was now rebadging a Japanese commuter and calling it a Pontiac. The rebellion had not merely been tamed, it had been outsourced. By the end, there was almost nothing underneath the badge that Pontiac could call its own. The last full lineup, in 2010, shared its bones across the corporation as a matter of routine. The Torrent, Pontiac's small crossover, was a Chevrolet Equinox with different lamps and a different name. Nearly every platform the division sold traced back to a Chevrolet or a corporate cousin. The brand that had been created to be the exception on the showroom floor had become a rack of grills, a set of faces the corporation kept on hand to bolt onto cars designed under other names. Here the record forces a question the bankruptcy would later obscure. If a Pontiac was a rebadged Chevrolet and a Pontiac was a rebadged Toyota, and the difference the customer paid for was a nameplate and a set of headlamps, then in what meaningful sense was there still a Pontiac to kill? The strategy that erased the brand had a name and a paper trail and a quarter century of internal memos behind it, and it had done its work long before any restructuring plan was drawn. Whether the true cause of death was written in those platform charts years before Washington and the balance sheet ever entered the story is the argument the comments were built to have. There is a bitter symmetry in the two cars. The Aztec was a Pontiac that GM designed by committee and got catastrophically wrong. The Vibe was a Pontiac that GM did not design at all and got quietly right. One was a General Motors failure and the other was a Toyota success, and neither was the thing a Pontiac had been created to be. Between them, they marked the two ways a proud name can be spent: squandered in a botched original or surrendered in a competent borrowing. The division that once forced every rival in Detroit to chase it now had nothing left that a rival would bother to copy. The advertising had promised excitement and the factories were delivering someone else's cars. The gap between the two had grown too wide for any slogan to close, and inside General Motors, the men reading the ledgers had, in truth, stopped trying. The brand was still on the price list and still in the showrooms, but the argument for its existence had been dismantled part by part until nothing structural remained. What was left was a formality, and formalities have a way of being observed. The account would come due not in a Detroit boardroom, but in a federal courthouse, with the government of the United States holding the pen. Chapter 5. The Certificate. The pen that would finish Pontiac was picked up in the autumn of 2008, and it did not belong to General Motors. For most of a century, the corporation had answered to no one about which of its brands lived and which of them died. It had created Pontiac, and it had hollowed Pontiac, and it had done both entirely as it pleased. That authority ended when the credit markets froze. As the financial crisis deepened through 2008 and into 2009, General Motors, the largest industrial company the country had ever built, found that it could no longer meet its own obligations, and it went to Washington for the money to stay alive. The money came, and it came with conditions. A company that takes the public's cash to survive surrenders the private right to decide its own shape, and the government that wrote the checks wanted to see in writing precisely how the patient intended to become solvent again. General Motors was required to produce a viability plan, a document that would earn every dollar of federal aid by naming what the corporation would cut. The scale of the intervention matched its authority. The federal government would commit roughly $50 billion to carry General Motors through its collapse, and it did not hand the money over and look away. The administration created a body to oversee the rescue, the Presidential Task Force on the Auto Industry, led by the financier Stephen Ratner, and it was that task force, not the executives on the upper floors of the General Motors building, that now sat in judgment of which brands were worth keeping. Before the reorganization was complete, the government would hold a controlling stake in the company itself, better than 60% of it, the taxpayer, briefly, the majority owner of General Motors. The men who had spent decades deciding what Pontiac would be had lost the authority to decide anything at all. The pen had passed to people who owed the brand nothing. On April 27, 2009, the corporation delivered its answer. General Motors announced that it would phase out Pontiac by 2010 and concentrate what was left of itself on what it called its four core brands: Chevrolet, Cadillac, Buick, and GMC. The decision carried no eulogy and no reckoning with what the name had meant. It was a single line in a restructuring plan, an entry in the ledger of what the company could no longer afford to keep. The word the plan reserved for the brands it would spare was core, and Pontiac was not among them. The division that had once ranked third in all of America, that had sold close to 1 million cars in the single year of 1968, was now a liability to be shed on a schedule set by a federal deadline. A little over a month later, on June 1st, 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy. It was at the time the fourth largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. The fate of Pontiac, a brand founded in a Michigan factory in 1926, had become a matter for a federal court settled inside a government-supervised reorganization rather than argued across a boardroom table in Detroit. There was a bleak accuracy to the arrangement. The corporation that had spent 25 years quietly emptying the brand of everything that had made it Pontiac would not even preside over the last rites. That office had passed to Washington, and Washington was not sentimental about a nameplate. The end itself came almost without ceremony. In January 2010, the last Pontiac ever built, a mid-sized sedan called the G6, moved down the assembly line at Orion Township, Michigan, and nothing followed it. The dealer franchise agreements, the contracts that had kept a Pontiac sign lit over showrooms across the country for generations, were left to expire on October 31st, 2010. When the last of them lapsed, an 82-year-old brand was simply gone. Its signs coming down in the same towns that had once sold the GTO and the Trans Am and the promise of excitement, and now sold nothing at all. Set against the bankruptcy that would take the blame, what had actually happened was simpler and older. The received account holds that the government's restructuring killed Pontiac, that a healthy brand was sacrificed to the terms of a bailout. But the filing did not kill Pontiac. It buried a body General Motors had already made. The performance had been engineered out, the identity badged away, the difference a customer once paid a premium for dissolved into shared platforms and a borrowed Toyota until a Pontiac was a Chevrolet and a different grille. By the time the viability plan marked the brand for deletion, there was no living division left to spare. The 2009 bankruptcy did not decide Pontiac's death. It signed the certificate for one the parent had caused years before the government ever reached for the pen. And in that signing lay a symmetry the record does not need to underline. Pontiac had come into the world in 1926 as a companion make, a lower-priced brand built to prop up the aging Oakland division, and it had grown so strong that it consumed the parent it was created to serve. Oakland was gone by 1932, and Pontiac stood in its place, the only companion brand General Motors ever produced that outlived the division above it. 8 decades later, the same fate circled back and found the survivor. The brand that had devoured its own parent was, at the last, devoured by its parent. The division that was born by breaking General Motors rules died with no rules left to break and nothing left to be but the same.